Myron, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. I'm a professor of philosophy at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia. And I also have an appointment at the University of British Columbia until August 2023 as a visiting professor in their Department of Psychology.
Cool. So the topic today is, would God's existence make the world a better place? Could you tell me a little bit about your position on the topic?
Yeah, so this is a research thread that was initiated through a colleague, a philosopher at what was formerly called Ryerson University, now Toronto Metropolitan University, named Klaus Cray. And he sponsored kind of a multi-year research initiative on what's known as the axiology of theism, right? The question of whether or not God's existence would add value to a world. And it's an interesting kind of research question because you have, regardless of where one lands on the overall rationality of religious belief, whether you think it's more or less plausible that there is no God or that some kind of agnostic position is more supported by evidence. You can still weigh in on the question to see, well, what difference would God's existence make? And you have, atheists and theists kind of lining up on similar positions, and kind of just a wide variety of cross sections there. So, in a couple of different papers, I explored this idea that, on balance, if there were a God, right, something a God described by concepts of omniscience and omnibenevolence, assuming that there's even a coherent view there, it seems like it would make the world a better place because you would have all sorts of reasons to think that things might be justified in the end, and there's different ways for theistic positions to kind of resolve that. So I think we can get into the weeds a little bit more. I think there are some interesting counter arguments to that though. So that's kind of where I landed at the time.
At the time, how do you land now?
Well, so to be honest, that was kind of a research topic for me, 7, 8, 9 years ago. So I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about it since then. I would say probably I'm still in the camp known as kind of pro-theism, right? So in an influential paper, Cray and Dragos kind of sketched out the taxonomy of logical space here in terms of positions that one could take. And so one position is to say, well, God's existence would make things better for everyone, or God's existence would make things better for a particular individual, or God's existence would make things worse for everyone, or God's existence would make things worse for one particular individual. And I mean, this kind of emphasis in philosophy of religion really got legs by some kind of throwaway quote from Thomas Nagel, who, when when reflecting on a theistic world, just had this quip, which is to say, well, that would be terrible. I wouldn't want to live in a world like that. I wouldn't want to live in a world that was kind of managed and superintended by a god. And then an Oxford philosopher, Guy Kahane, kind of picked up on Nagel's quote and tried to flesh it out a little bit to say, what would be the argument there? If we were to develop this into an argument to say it would actually be a bad thing if there were a God, what would that look like? And so then since Kahane's, trying to flesh that out, a number of other philosophers have jumped in and kind of picked up this really interesting question.
What is like the minimum criterion for a God? Because my initial response is that I'd be agnostic. It could be better or worse, but it would all depend on what the qualities of the God were. And so the question doesn't really give a strict definition. So what kind of definition of a God are we talking about when this question is usually asked?
Yeah, I think it's typically kind of framed in terms of classic theism, right? So the omni God, who the creator, sustainer, that kind of thing, morally interested.
So I recently had a conversation with someone who was a theist, but took the position that it would make the world worse in at least one respect, which was that because the omni God was omniscient and knew everything, he would know all of our actions. And so it would be like watching us at all times, kind of
Yeah.
having a universal
Yeah.
voyeur would inherently make the world worse.
Yeah, so that is that's one worry that people have, and I remember presenting kind of an early um, version of one of the papers that I had written on this in a context, and um, the philosopher Evan Fales was in the room, and he really pushed back and said, he would be really freaked out about violations of privacy, right? So there are concerns about violations of privacy and violations of autonomy, and there are also concerns about the ability for one to pursue a meaningful life, right? So if it were the case that God's existence would prevent a person from pursuing a life that had subjective meaning for them, well, then you could see how from that person's perspective, it would, God's existence would make things worse for them, right? And so this is why I say, like, there are interesting ways to frame, um, anti-theistic kind of positions, not atheistic positions, but anti-theistic in the space of values, which is to say, that God's existence wouldn't necessarily be a good thing, but
Yeah, absolutely. I guess from my perspective, thinking of it like if there was something out there that was intrinsically interested in your values and helping you achieve your values, that would
mhm.
obviously something most people would want.
Yeah.
But from the same perspective, you could say that the universe itself wanted that without any kind of conscious intention.
Mm.
That may actually end up being better, more
Yeah.
preferable.
What does it mean for the universe to want without having intentions? Because
Well,
you,
it would just be like like a force or something that it gravitated towards achieving your goals.
yeah, yeah, I see. Yeah, I think there's ways to kind of to flesh that out. I mean, so um, philosophers who are kind of inclined to think that there are good responses to these worries that people might have about the value that God's existence would add would say, well, if and it really kind of depends on how you pack in what you pack into an omnibenevolent God, or um, and how you conceive of those attributes. Because I mean, if like a perfectly good moral agent, right, who has your best interests as part of their concern, you might wonder, well, what would be the harm in having an agent like that know me better than even I know me, right? Um, and when it comes to uh, conceptions about what it is that we can find meaningful, or our own kind of subjective sense of what a meaningful life would consist in. I mean, one thing that I've kind of wondered about is whether or not there are facts about what a meaningful life consists in, right? Facts beyond my own subjective awareness, and it seems like on the one hand, I kind of start from this idea that, well, you know it's my life, damn it. I mean, if it's a meaningful life, I ought to be able to choose the criteria by which I pursue a meaningful life. And yet, on the other hand, I think, but it seems like I can be wrong about it. Like I can be wrong about what constitutes a meaningful life for me. Not just like my criteria change over time, but where I kind of look back on certain kind of trajectories that I might have pursued and think, that was actually a mistake. I thought pursuing X would be meaningful, and it actually and I was able to pursue X and achieve it, and it turns out that it wasn't. And so if the criteria for the meaningfulness of one's life are the kinds of things that one could be mistaken about, then it seems that they're determined by facts that go beyond just my own subjective say so, right? So so that kind of got me into this territory to say, well, that then maybe if there is if we were considering the existence of an omni God, right, who had my interests as part of their concern and knows what meaningfulness is more than I do, well, then one could see that even concerns about the ability to pursue a meaningful life might go away. But not everyone agrees with that, and Kirk Lougheed, who's published a lot in this area, has pushed back on that to say, no, there are answers to those kinds of concerns. So it is interesting territory to think about.
My initial thought is that any potential benefit that could be achieved with a god could be also achieved without the god. So say something like you want a heaven or whatever. There could be a
Mm-hmm.
heaven without a god being to create it. So something like Buddhistic field or something that just exists as a fundamental nature of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think about it from a perspective of if we can achieve all of the like pragmatic benefits, would
Mm-hmm.
we want a mind there, or would we want it to be simply a feature of nature in and of itself? I
Mm-hmm.
tend to intuitively feel like if it was just a feature of nature in and of itself, that would feel grander. I'd feel more
Mm-hmm.
connected to nature,
Mm-hmm.
rather than it being a mind. Because with a mind, it feels less genuine, less real in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so that's actually, I mean, there are some interesting adjacent questions here. So the initial question is, would God's existence make things better or worse? Is it the kind of thing that we should think is going to add value to a world? So there's that. But then the questions you're kind of raising are kind of parallel to that, which is to say, regardless of how you answer that question, you might wonder, you know, even if God's existence would make things better, is there actually, a different state of affairs that would actually be better than God's existence, right? And
Well,
it seems
more
like what you're.
specifically, I'm saying if we consider the idea that God would make things better than the way we perceive the world today, um, could the naturalistic universe also be better in that same
Mm-hmm,
respect? And so, if we're asking
mm-hmm,
the question, would God make the world better than this world? I mean, obviously, there's lots of things wrong with this world.
mm-hmm.
But if we're trying to contrast what we would imagine a perfect world to be like under the conditions of a perfect being creating it, we could
Right,
also
right, right.
imagine what a perfect world would be like under the conditions I don't know, a
Mm-hmm,
perfect moral law was creating it. And
mm-hmm.
so, from the
Right, right, right.
perspective of like my thoughts, it seems like the God isn't the only option there. There's like a large spectrum of possibilities of both a naturalistic force making things better and
Mm-hmm.
a intentional being making things better than the way we are now.
Right,
And would it be required for a God to do that? I don't think so. I think we could
right,
have that without the God.
right. So that's, I mean, so that's the, is there some, valuable state of affairs X such that can only be achieved by God's existence and can't be achieved in any other kind of naturalistic scenario, right? And um, or you might even ask the inverse, right? Is there some state of, valuable state of affairs only achievable in a naturalistic universe, right? Such that it would be better than a theistic inclusive, a God inclusive universe. So those are, yeah, it's hard to know exactly, you know how to. I think that's interesting territory to try and flesh out what those states of affairs might be.
Do you have an inclination of an answer? Because mine right now is that it wouldn't be. Like mine is that I don't think there's anything logically possible that couldn't be achieved in a God universe versus a naturalistic universe. And so any potential benefit would be achievable in both, except for the intrinsic nature of the consciousness being the cause. And if consciousness is the cause, to me, I see that as, again, less real because it feels like from a selfish perspective, it feels like there's a greater thing out there than me, and that I am
Mm-hmm.
subject to. Whereas if nature is essentially the foundation, it doesn't feel like that as much. It doesn't feel like you're as trapped underneath some bigger weight out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think. I mean, yeah, I'd have to mull more on that. I think that the idea that you know there is a minded agency that you know cares, right, is there's a pull there to see that that allows for possibilities that you don't get when there is no minded kind of sense of caring, like I like Paul Draper's hypothesis of indifference when he frames kind of the scenario of considering two two possible kind of explanations for the observed behaviors of and experiences of sentient creatures, right? And on the one hand, you can say, you factor in all of the pleasure and all of the pain that is experienced by sentient creatures, and you think, okay, what accounts for that? Biological facts of pain and suffering and all these things. Is it more plausible to think that is explained by the world being created and managed by a perfect being who loves you and cares, or is it more plausible to think that experience is best explained by an indifferent universe, right? And so, if you're thinking about like the universe as being morally interested in a person's experience, it doesn't seem to make I think that we should think that the universe doesn't care about me, right? Because it's not built to do that kind of thing. So then if you think about what's possible in a completely naturalistic scenario on that framework, then I think adding kind of a minded perfect being creates some opportunities that an indifferent universe just doesn't. But that's just my kind of ripping it initially. So I think that's going to be where you're going to get some benefits in a God inclusive universe that you don't get in an indifferent universe.
But isn't that seems to be based on our bias right now, that the universe right now, as we see it, doesn't care about us at all. Clearly, 99% of the universe is out to kill us, essentially, and we can't live there.
But this is a safe space, though, right here.
Seems a relatively safe space for temporarily.
Right.
But it seems like that's not like if we lived in a universe that was teeming with life, everywhere was abundant to life, there was no death or aging, and just the universe itself was built in such a way that it was conducive to achieving our ends, then we probably wouldn't think that. So it seems like the reason we have that inclination is because when we in the world we live in, it's clearly not very well designed for us. But if it happens to be more towards our liking or more towards our comfort, then we probably wouldn't think that. And so that seems to be more just of a bias based on the experiences we have, and not something that's like intrinsic to a naturalistic uncaring universe in and of itself. So if we just assume the universe doesn't care, that doesn't necessarily mean it's more predisposed to be such a way that it would lead to this kind of world where there's lots of suffering and death. That seems to just be a thing of chance, more or less. And so
you might compare that to like different like the variability that is among people in terms of their own psychological dispositions, right?
Yeah, or God's disposition. So I'd say that the same thing would apply to the potential God.
So some people, for example, just seem to be built to have kind of an optimistic outlook. They don't tend to, depression or anxiety. They seem to be relatively happy. That's kind of their thermostat's kind of set, like at San Diego mean of like between 78 and 82. It's just optimum all the time. And they kind of have a relatively happy existence, right? But that's not the only way that things could go. As we see, some people have different kind of psychological makeups and environments that kind of nurture them in particular ways, and they struggle more, right? They have just a harder kind of thing, and you might think that in the space of possible universes, maybe we're in one where the universe seems kind of just indifferent, and that causes us to wonder about these things. But had things gone a little different way, and the temperature and the default was, as you say, teeming with life and all these other things, maybe it wouldn't even occur to us. So there's a variability that's there too.
Yeah, my thought right here is that when we ask the question, would the universe be better or would the world be better with God's existence, we're assuming that the universe has no intrinsic properties of goodness, I think, and that God does have some intrinsic properties of goodness or goal-drivenness of one particular kind rather than another. But if we assume variability to God, say God has personalities like humans, you have a God who wants to torture everybody, so clearly that would make the world worse. We have a God who wants to give everyone eternal life and happiness with no suffering. That would make the universe better. But this property that we're adding in, we're assuming God has this property, but the universe doesn't. Whereas it may be the case that the universe can have that property too. And so we're it's like an inflection of the problem of suffering is that we know there's suffering and we think God has good reasons, but he's perfectly good. And so would
Hmm.
God existing be better because there's this extra property there that wouldn't be there otherwise?
Hmm.
But I think that extra property could still be there because I'm a big fan of the Eastern religions, of the
Hmm.
essences of the forces of the universe that predate the gods, the Brahmin cycles, and
Hmm.
the just fields of morality. And I think those are
Hmm.
legitimate ideas that aren't really taken as seriously in apologetics as they should be, that offer up a possibility of a naturalistic universe being just as catering to our whims as a conscious being doing so.
Hmm.
And so from my perspective, it's the question seems to like inherently have this bias that the universe can't or won't have that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think well, and you know, most of what passes for apologetics kind of engagement with philosophy and philosophy of religion is just really, really bad and shallow, and I call it kind of playing intellectual shell games. So as long as you can hide the burning question under the right shell so that no one can take a look at it, then you can kind of get um, you know
Kalam cosmological argument.
so but I think that oh, so yeah. So I was gonna ask. So like, where, like, are you an objectivist about moral properties? Like, what are you? Yeah, and um,
Yes, I'm a moral realist.
yeah. Okay. So yeah. So I think um, yeah. I wouldn't want to say that that the only way to get kind of moral realism is through divine command or theism, right? Like I think there are lots of philosophically interesting naturalistic accounts of morality, both from an evolutionary perspective in terms of how we come to make moral judgments and how it contributes to our survival as a species. That's kind of one very interesting story, and I think the people that I know who know more about evolutionary psychology than I do, particularly moral psychology, it's interesting. They tend towards being non-realists about morality. There's just it's kind of just explained away as a product of what's been useful for us. Um, and I see the attraction of that too, quite frankly. Um, but then, yeah. So anyway, I'm just kind of rambling, but.
Yeah, I think that's the current consensus among scientists is that's just a product of evolution. And then, strangely enough, philosophers have like 60 something percent are atheist, and also 60 something believe in moral realism.
Mm-hmm.
Ironically, but yeah, most everyday every like people out in the world, not
Mm-hmm.
academics in armchairs, are also like in the sciencey realm of it's mostly just a product of evolution. But yeah, I think that it's a legitimate idea. I think it's equally as legitimate an idea that there is such a thing as a moral force out there, or a platonic
Mm-hmm.
moral object, or an a priori abstract truth somewhere out there that
Interesting.
of morality, as there is God. I think those are. I don't think either have like strong empirical evidence, but both are equally plausible from my
Right.
perspective.
Well, and I mean, there's like the buck has to stop somewhere, right? And for theists, when they get both pushed and shoved, they will cling to the idea of God as a necessary being, right? And so um, and then in response to the question about, well, what explains God, the standard kind of response, the standard kind of explanation that's given, which is not really super explanatory, is just this idea that, well, God is, as a necessary being, God's existence is explained by God's own nature, right? And so you think, well, okay, that's kind of that's the argument stopper. That's where things kind of come to an end. And then you compare that to kind of a naturalistic scenario, which kind of essentially is either making the same kind of claim about the existence of matter, right? Well, we just there's just no way to push back to the question of why is there something rather than nothing. We just can't. There's just no way to really get a good answer to that question. We're just not built for that. Um, so they're epistemologically like very similar in my view. Like there's so I'm not like so I'm happy to identify as a theist, but I don't make any bones about whether or not like the theistic explanation really has that much more going for it epistemologically. And that's where a lot of the apologists, I think, they just way overestimate the plausibility of theistic, quote unquote explanations as being superior alternatives to very viable naturalistic counterparts. And that's the shell game, right? So.
Yeah, I've actually taken the approach of just using theists' own exact language and applying it to naturalism. So like, I believe in an unnecessary being too. It's just a quantum field. I have a quantum field necessary being.
Right. So
yeah.
And I mean, I think a lot of the, like what kind of draws people to certain views or positions is explained more, by individual psychology and sociocultural factors than it is about any philosophical, pedigree. Which isn't to say that there isn't interesting. Like I think, you mentioned being attracted to Eastern ways of thinking, about ultimate reality, and I think that's like there's lots of benefit in mining these, for lack of a better word, religious traditions for. As data points for our own reflection on these things, and I think that that's also true of Christianity and Islam and other forms of spirituality.
Yeah, I think it's really sad that a lot of the apologists don't, or just dismiss those out of hand and say, well, that can't be possible. That doesn't even make sense. God has to be a perfect deity, divine being where ground and goodness are inherently the same thing and inseparable and unchanging. Like, and that's the thing that makes perfect sense. And then mysticism and Eastern mysticism, like, nope, completely irrational.
Right.
So could you tell me some more about the arguments? Like, what are some of the ways which a God existing could arguably add some betterness to the universe?
Yeah, well, one argument is just this idea that anytime you consider any state of affairs, if you introduce a morally perfect being into that state of affairs, it's going to make things better. So even in the scenario that you considered earlier, an indifferent universe, but just a better universe, right? One that's better designed for own flourishing and happiness. It's really, really a great, let's say ecosystem and environment in which to have, one's lifespan. That's a pretty great scenario. But wouldn't it be even better if on top of that you added an all-powerful, morally perfect being who has your interests at heart? They could make things even better, right? That doesn't seem implausible to think that any scenario, good or bad, is going to be improved upon by adding a morally perfect agent to it, unless we ourselves are gods in that respect.
Well, how would that make it better? Like, suppose we had a perfect world, just the objectively perfect world. Right. I would define that as something like a world where it would be impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing, either via the laws of physics or from other beings. So if you don't want to age, you just snap your fingers, no more aging. Don't want to be hungry, snap your fingers, no more being hungry. And so suppose we had something like this. And so if the God existed, it wouldn't change any of the propositions about the universe.
Yeah. So I think the built-in assumption there that you're pointing out is that any scenario involving, finite creatures, right? Finite agents, so there have to be things that we just can't bring about by snapping our fingers. And so that's kind of built into this perfectly good agent argument, right? So there must be things, if it's the case that even in really good scenarios in kind of these teeming with life universes that you kind of described, if there are some things that we just can't do, then having an agent introduced into that scenario that helps account for our own limitations would make things better. Even if things are going swimmingly well, it could be even better. But I guess I'd probably agree with you to say, well then, but if it's the case that I have all of that power and I have that capability, well then what, in what sense would it make it better for there to be another being like me, right? Um, but in I don't know, I'd have to flesh it out a little bit more. But then that might itself be an illustration of this morally good agent principle, which is to say that anytime you introduce a morally good, perfect agent into a scenario, it improves things. And in that case, I'm the morally perfect agent, right? Or I'm the, you know, so I'd have to kind of tease that out a little bit.
Yeah, because my thoughts there is that I don't. Why is there that assumption that we can't do everything? Why is that inherently included into this argument? Because when we think of a God and
Right.
what it can do, why is it making things better? Well, it's giving us more opportunities or more power or whatever to do things we couldn't do. But that would just we're essentially saying that the goodness is some whatever our freedom is, some amount of freedom that we're missing, and that's what the perfect goodness is. Or if we imagine we're trying to say by making things better towards some end goal, what is that end goal? Well, the end goal is some amount of freedom for ourselves, kind of like what I was describing, where a world where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. um, Now that would not necessarily mean you're morally perfect. So for example, there could be I could have my own universe
Yeah.
where I do whatever I want, and then Hitler could have his own universe. And as
Mm-hmm.
long as every conscious being couldn't be forced to do anything they don't consent to, you can still have moral bad people, and that's
Mm-hmm.
fine. So none of us would necessarily be morally perfect agents, but we would have perfect freedom to some degree to design
Mm-hmm.
our own universes. And in that case, suppose we added one extra being, a morally perfect one of us. Would that change anything? Would that do anything in this universe? Probably not. I wouldn't see any addition there. So, like, if we
So,
imagined, go ahead.
well, so okay. So, what do you think about like? So, imagine one of these kind of encapsulated kind of universes where you've got, uh, an agent who maybe they're the only sentient conscious agent that exists in that universe, and they're able to torture, virtual, holograms, right, that have no like consciousness or anything like that, but they're able to kind of, live out their torture, goals, and no and your principle is not violated because no one is being coerced to do anything against their consent, and everyone in that universe has perfect freedom to do whatever they want without, and there's no one else being harmed. But as a moral realist, you might wonder, like, is is that good for them, right? Like, and so they're a morally bad person, let's just say, or they're, they're living an existence that is certainly suboptimal because they're taking pleasure in all these really horrific things, even though no one is harmed. There's still some damage to their own psyche, you might think. Um, what would adding a morally perfect agent into that universe do, right? Would it You might think that, you know just in terms of calculating the quantity of goodness in a world, adding a morally perfect agent into that world would make things overall better, at least in the sense that there is an agent that actually is morally better. Um, and you might also think that you know there would be, introducing, a godlike agent into that world would make possible certain futures, even for that Hitler type person, right? So suppose, and here it kind of depends what you pack into this morally perfect agent, but you know, I think this is why, like, Michael Tooley is a protheist, right? I mean, he kind of came out in this project where, and he even though he's uh, a very prominent kind of atheist, um, is persuaded that, well, no, like, if there were a God, it would actually open up the possibility um, uh, for certain kinds of good futures that wouldn't be possible in a God exclusive world. So I think, even in that only one, like, what do you think about the possibility of introducing a morally perfect being like God into that single person universe.
Yeah, so if we start with a universe with just one guy and he's just playing with like video games, essentially video game characters and torturing them, I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't see you mentioned that you think there's like a damage to his being in some way. I don't see that. I see it as like his identity would essentially be designed by him, where he could change it at will. And if that's what he values, to be playing video games in Dark Souls and torturing the enemies in Dark Souls, I'm all for it. Please destroy all the enemies in Dark Souls. They're terrible. But I wouldn't see any inherent problem with that. And if we added, suppose there's we just pop into existence a perfectly moral being. If that moral being was able to infringe on this guy's freedom to torture his video game characters, I would see that as immoral. I would see that as bad. Unless, of course, the guy consented to it. He consented to this being engaging in a cooperative relationship, then it's fine. But I wouldn't see that as a logical impossibility for him to do on his own anyway. So he could, like, if he decided he wanted to change the universe in such a way to make it Gandhi, or essentially just a Gandhi universe or Buddha universe, he could do that. And so that same outcome would be equally as possible without the morally perfect being. And the only addition there would be having a relationship. And I think that in that way, there's a betterness added, that if you're alone in the universe and you want another person there, having another person would definitely be a benefit. But then I don't think it needs to be a god. It can just be another person of any essential degree. And so I don't think adding in a perfectly good being into that situation in and of itself would make it better, even though the moral character of the being may be better. I don't think that actually adds any moral actions to the universe, because the moral actions would be infringing on or assisting of the will of the individual in the universe in the first place. And if the moral being would impose on him to make him change, that would be bad. I'd say that would be immoral unless he consented in the first place. So Hitler being himself in his universe, as long as he isn't harming anybody, I wouldn't say would be you mentioned damaging his character in some way. I don't think
psyche.
Yeah. I don't think that would necessarily be true. I think that would be more like watching a scary movie or playing a scary video game. I don't think it damages anybody's character.
Yeah. I mean, those are, there's an empirical kind of element to that, like at least something that could be investigated through, like, and they're like, I'm not an alarmist about screen time or video games, right? But you kind of imagine, though, like if a person 24/7 is engaging, in virtual torturous acts and just taking just real pleasure in that, right? I guess part of it is, what's the ability to dissociate reality from kind of the virtual reality, right? And maybe you could build that into this single person universe where they at no time do they ever think that these are actual people, right? And so then there's no danger of harm there. It's interesting, though, when you said that, like you said that the only potential benefit that would be there would be relationship, right? And so, but you wouldn't need a god you wouldn't need a morally perfect agent to receive benefits of relationship. But you might think that, well, I mean, you seem like a nice person, and you and I can have a friendship and a relationship that receive the benefit of that. But if you were God, right, and if you were like a morally perfect, morally interested, omnibenevolent being, as good as our actual friendship could be, that would be even better, right? I mean, so you might think that because there are benefits that would accrue to me by being in relationship with a being like that just wouldn't be available in kind of a friendship among peers in a way.
Well, I would agree that the character of the individual will change the dynamics of the relationship, but I think the quality of the relationship would depend on what kind of relationship you're looking for. So, for example, someone like me, I would want more something like a competitive relationship, someone to play a video game against. And if he's not doing very good at torturing the bad guys in Dark Souls, and I just destroy the Dark Souls demons, then he's not going to be very good competition for me. And so I don't think that his inherent goodness would
Hmm.
necessarily lead to a better relationship. I think it depends
Yeah,
on the
well,
relationship you want.
but this circles back to then questions about what our perspectives on pursuing meaningful lives, right? And like I agree, certainly. I mean, there are things, excuse me, that you know, it's not like relationship with a perfect being, you know, achieves every possible good. There are some goods that in relationship that can't be achieved in relationship with a perfect being, right? Like, so friendship among peers, right? Finite peers uh, can experience like mutual, a kind of reciprocity and a mutual kind of sharing of meaning that really isn't possible when the relationship is there's this great kind of ontological gap. Like you could screw up and or I could screw up. That's much more plausible. I could screw up and you could forgive me, right? Whereas if
Or
I'm in
apologize. You
relationship,
could apologize. So, like, if you
right,
hurt me and then apologize, that
right,
would be a good,
right, a
that
good
an
that could,
experience that wouldn't happen from a perfect being.
right. So if I'm in a relationship with God, I never get the chance to forgive God for messing up, right, or for having that kind of reciprocity. And so I mean these are all relative goods. There might be outweighing factors, for
Well, is there an
so
inverse there? So, say we have a friendship and I have a
right,
friendship with a perfect being. Is
yeah,
there some quality difference between those two? Because from my perspective, I don't intuitively see a difference in the quality of the friendship between a perfect being versus an imperfect being to be
mm-hmm.
able to assess that one would be preferable to the other.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think. Um, well, if you're, um, you know, and part like there's a sense in which relationship, um, to what degree is, are the requirements of relationship this kind of intentional leaning into this kind of psychological space of I know you, you know me, and we can kind of share meanings. Certainly, um, when it comes to any possible kind of God creature kind of relationship, you can't do that. I mean, in the same kind of standard ways, right? I can look at your face, I can read mental states. I might be wrong about what you're thinking, but I can just there's a sensitivity to empirical kind of data that's just not there in the God creature kind of case. Um, so, but you know, depending on what you pack into your God concept, one of the benefits would be that if you think that the 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 intentional kind of trajectory of God is to you know redeem suffering and bring kind of a loving end to all kind of creatures. Well, that's okay. There's an upside there that you get with God that you don't get with peer to peer, right? But then, so that might be one possible kind of avenue of benefit in the God, agent kind of relationship that you don't get among peers.
Well, two things there. One is that I wouldn't see a problem with God actually being able to be a person like mini Jesus, just send a Jesus version of himself to talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wouldn't see that as a point against God. I'd say he could be equally as personal as a human
Mm-hmm.
interactive kind of relationship. But in the case where he has an intention to make the or have an outcome for everyone being perfectly loving or whatever, the outcome thing I would see as subjective to his universe bubble. So if everyone gets their own universe bubble where they can have their own intentions
Right.
and outcomes or whatever. And the fact
Mm-hmm.
that he has an intention that he wants everyone to have a good outcome really wouldn't affect anything from my perspective. Like everyone gets to decide for themselves what they want in their
Mm-hmm.
universe. And so whether or not there's this extra being out there who has an intention of good or evil wouldn't really make much of a difference one way or the other, except in the fact of how it would affect the relationship. And from my perspective, if I have a relationship with a perfect being who has this good intention for me versus having a relationship with someone who's just you do you kind of a relationship.
Yeah.
I don't see what one would add other than unless I have a personal preference of someone who I want to interact with like that.
So, but it's interesting to me, like what is maybe, and maybe you don't have a strong view here. You mentioned kind of Platonic, you know, abstract, you know, a priori kind of moral principles, but like what is it that kind of grounds the what are the truth makers for moral facts kind of in your universe, right?
I'd say it's a force of nature, like essentially like gravity, just literally a thing that exists in nature, a field, quantum field, like any other quantum field. I really like the analogies to the Buddhist field of morality. It's just a field. It's just a thing out there, a fundamental aspect of nature that is a compositional part of the building blocks of reality.
Right. So then, in even if everyone, so do you think that that's going to hold across universes? Is that kind of, or is that going to vary from universe to universe? Because if it holds across universes, then even if autonomous Hitler is able to, create their own, universe of possibilities and not harm anyone, I guess the question is, are they going to be, you know, um, subject to kind of this universal moral law that is just a part of nature, or not? And if they are subject to this kind of universal kind of moral force, then you know either they it can't just be subjectivity all the way down.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I would say that yes, there is the one moral law, and the moral law is it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing, and that's like
Oh,
the
okay, so that
absolute
that
moral law.
right, and everything else beyond that is kind of subjective preference.
Right. So like Hitler
Mhm.
playing video games, he can gas all the Jews he wants in a video game, not immoral whatsoever. It's like totally
Mhm.
fine. If Nazis want to play video games and make their own kind of white supremacist video games, I see nothing wrong with that. They should have the right to do that as long as it doesn't extend out to harming anybody who's actually conscious. Then I don't think that is in any way immoral. And so the
but
one
but
moral law that would be subject to is it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing.
Okay. Well, there's certainly consistency there. I think that that's a pretty, like, if you're going to be a moral realist, um, like that's a pretty slim foundation. And you'd have to kind of then as a consequence, right? And you just articulated a consequence. You'd have to say that like um, there's no qualitative difference between a world in which you know Hitler is uh, doing terrible things to virtual beings, uh, and a parallel world in which still kind of one autonomous agent, but instead of torturing virtual beings, they actually build loving,
Cathedrals
virtual,
and
yeah,
charities and
well,
things.
lovely, yeah, loving virtual communities and get to pursue a life of virtue and excellence, right? So
Yeah.
and that's so you would say there's no qualitative difference because in both cases the universal moral law of not a non-coercive existence is being adhered to.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that in that case, the what
So I
makes
would see that as
each
a bug, not a feature,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
Well,
I think that I agree. Like it, if that's kind of the framing of your moral realism, I think there is a self consistency there. But I think it just on the face of it, it just tastes a little funny, right? Like to say that, you know, um,
well, I see it. I really
that there's,
like
that there's no
the
quality.
Buddhist argument
Mhm.
there, where it's like there's different ways to come to enlightenment. One is the way of perfect morality, and one is the way of perfect evil. Like you can potentially change your character by going in either direction and learning the truth. And so it isn't necessarily the case that you must adhere to one particular lifestyle to, I don't know, maximize your your nature. I just had a debate with somebody. We're talking about the good is living in accordance with your nature or something along those lines. And
Mhm.
so if Hitler's nature is such that he enjoys this kind of virtual gassing chamber, um, and he's in accordance with that nature and is happy in his universe, I think that is a moral good. As long as he's not hurting anybody else, totally fine. And I think the same thing would apply to the case to the Mother Teresa universe, where if she is in accordance with her nature by building cathedrals and helping people, that's also a moral good. And
So in yours, like, what do you do with the concept of self-harm? Like, is it possible to harm oneself?
yes, so I think that as long as you're in a rational state of mind and you choose it voluntarily, it's perfectly moral. So assisted suicide, I think, is moral. Um,
Right,
if
right, right, right. But
suppose you're a scientist and you have no mental or physical handicaps and you just want to see, I want to experience death and commit suicide, perfectly moral, nothing wrong with that.
yeah, I'm not even thinking just in terms of suicide. It's kind of a potential case of self-harm, but even just acting in ways that are freely chosen but self-damaging, right? That's not really possible for you.
What do you mean? So I would say that you can design the universe to allow anything you want. So if you want to make a universe exactly like this one, this Earth that we live
Mm-hmm.
in with cancer and death, you could do that. And if you consent to it, then all of the actions inside of it would be equally as moral because you've consented to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that would include
Yeah.
drinking, drunk driving,
Mm-hmm.
sexting, sexting on the internet with Twitter, all kinds of things.
Yeah. Um, Again, that just kind of tastes funny, right? It's just like when one thinks about comparing, like, if it really is just you know freedom and autonomy to pursue, like to pursue a non-coerced existence. It just seems like we can use that. There are you know there are better and worse ways to pursue that. But maybe that's just my inbuilt bias, right? To kind of say, well, why should we think that there are? So I guess, I mean, what is so great about not being coerced? You might
Well,
think,
to
like,
me,
why?
I have the opposite intuition there. Is if we reject that principle and adopt something like what it seems like you're saying is that there's this better end goal and you're obligated to move towards that end goal. You're being pushed to it. And if you don't do it, you're doing something wrong. To me, that feels like prison in a way, or like you're being tortured, or cattle being led, or something that you're being forced towards this outcome, whether you want it or not. Um,
Mhm.
Not by your choosing, which seems intrinsically or intuitively immoral in and of itself. So if there is this like divine end goal that you're obligated to pursue, um,
I'm not even
then
necessarily saying it may not even be, it may not be divine end goal. It just might be that the moral the moral landscape might have more than just one peak on it, right? It might have multiple peaks on it. There might be multiple, you know, laws or principles that are part of the moral fabric of the universe, other than just freedom to pursue ends uncoerced. I guess I'm just kind of like, it just seems to me like you know I'm the kind of person that could be mistaken about what's good for me, right? And unless you're kind of packing into this kind of universe, um, you know, the cognitive capacity to never make a mistake like that, I think that if it's possible for me to be mistaken about it, then it's because there are facts that I don't get to determine, right? And so if it's facts that I don't get to determine, it can't just be pursuing ends that I just set for myself.
well, I'm curious what you mean by a mistake in that context, because it would be like if I could play any video game I wanted to in my own universe, design it how I want. I'm obviously going to play some bad ones that are boring, and I mean, that'd be about as much of a mistake as you can
Mm-hmm.
have. But it's more like that seems more like the hypothetical imperative kind of aspect rather than the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative would be like it's impossible
Mm-hmm.
to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing, but then everything else is just your subjective hypothetical imperative of I want to maximize this today and I want to maximize
Mm-hmm.
this tomorrow. And so any given outcome, like Hitler doing his Hitler thing, maybe tomorrow he's going to do the Mother Teresa thing and just try something new. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
subjective preference for that eternity, and then he's going to change it. And I imagine if this universe was to exist, there would probably be a large spectrum of changes and possibilities all the time for each individual, and it wouldn't just aggregate towards just Hitler doing Hitler literally for eternity. And in this spectrum, there would be probably an aggregation towards some extremes, like you're saying, of certain kinds of preferences. But I wouldn't say that they're obligated. They're not an obligation or things that we would want people to have to or lead to. It would just be a natural hypothetical imperative of take your time.
Right. So if in that universe, autonomous Hitler looks back and kind of thinks to themselves, I thought that one game was what was going to be good for me, but it actually turned out not to be good. Um, you would just say, that's psychological weakness. You're not really thinking clearly. You're mistaken about whether or not you were mistaken, because at the time you were pursuing these ends. No one was harmed. It was what you wanted, and so it was good. And so your judgment at a later time, reflecting back, to say, maybe experiencing some regret or remorse and thinking, that wasn't right for me. In this present moment, you'd be saying, yeah, that's just crazy talk.
Like if he was saying that going back in time, I would do something differently.
Yeah,
I
if
think
I could go back and do it over again, I would make different choices.
I mean, I wouldn't see anything wrong with that. I wouldn't see either action as being bad. I'd say that the character of the person has changed over time, and that as the character of the person changed, their desires changed, and both of those are good. So
but you would say that their belief at the present, that what they did in the past was suboptimal, is wrong. Is mistaken. Like that.
Like if they believe there is some objective criterion of maximization, and back then it wasn't achieving that objective criterion, yeah, I'd say that was false. I would say from a hypothetical subjective perspective that in order to reach the ideology that they are presently at, there is a means to do that is more efficient than the means that they took. That could definitely be true.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yeah, I think so you must get this question a lot, though, like why is a universe where Hitler is playing these horrific video games, they're the only agent in that universe? Why is that better than a parallel universe where the harm is being caused to actual people, right? Not just virtual people. Like, what is the argument to say that universe A is better than universe B?
I think that my evidence of morality is moral intuition and moral progress, and the pattern I see in that is that infringing on conscious agents without their consent seems to be the underlying principle that accurately describes what I see as the evidence of moral realism. And so a world where actual conscious agents are being infringed upon against their will would be actual morality, whereas infringing on virtual agents like in a video game doesn't seem to correspond to that, the moral intuitions that we have that infringing on will is bad. Because if like you're killing a video game character, you're not actually killing anybody. It's a bunch of ones and zeros. And so there's nothing intuitively that we feel is wrong about it. Whereas if you're killing a person who has a conscious agents and intentions and doesn't want to die, we do feel that is intuitively wrong. And so I think those intuitions do actually correspond to some moral truth, which is that conscious agents have moral value.
Mm-hmm. So that's an auxiliary assumption for your moral principle, is that conscious agents have equal moral value.
Yes, I think that all conscious agents have moral value.
Mm-hmm. And are worthy of moral, like have, and whose interests are. How do you cash out? Like, would you say that each conscious agent has equivalent moral value, or like their moral interests are have equal weight to one's own?
Probably yes. I'd say that in a perfect moral universe, no conscious agent would go left ungiven a perfect world. So I don't know if there was a difference, it would be so minute in my model that it would be negligible. So
wouldn't be salient.
Yeah. So like a fly is conscious, it has moral value, and it should be given its own universe where it can do whatever it wants, and as much so as I would. There's probably going to be a pragmatic approach of, if we could give one first, should we do the fly or the human? I'd probably go with human, because there's less larger cognitive space to do things. But I'd say that the moral significance, the fly still has moral significance. There's just a pragmatic limitation of who we can give the freedoms to first.
Mhm. But I mean, if you have an infinite space of universes, let every fly have their own.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, that's that's a. I mean, that's an awesome multiverse right
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. No Thanoses. Thanos is not allowed.
there. Well, no, Thanos is allowed just in their own
Right.
space, right?
He can't
Yeah,
break the rule and
can't break the rule.
vaporize half the universes.
Oh man, but in no possible universe is Thor: Love and Thunder worth. So
Yeah,
I think we can agree. That's another moral principle.
Yeah, there's going to be certain things we're going to ban, like just boy bands, just all boy bands, not in any universe ever.
That's funny.
But we've been going for about an hour. It was a really great conversation. I appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any people links or references where they can find more about your work?
Sure. My website is myronapenner.com, and feel free to check that out if you want to look at what I'm up to these days.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Likewise, Tom. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.